The sun was blazing over Ouagadougou that morning, a city once known for its resilience, now about to witness history being rewritten. Thousands of people filled the square, their faces calm yet expectant. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that comes before something sacred. And then, a man stepped forward. He wasn't a conqueror. He wasn't from a global superpower. He was the Prime Minister of Jamaica, a descendant of the enslaved, standing before the people of Burkina Faso, the descendants of the unbroken. The cameras zoomed in, and his voice, soft but steady, cut through the air. Today is not a day for politics. It is a day for courage. A day for an apology that carries not just words, but substance. That was the moment the world stopped pretending. Because what followed wasn't diplomacy, it was redemption. Jamaica, a small island that once suffered under the same colonial weight as Africa, was now offering a $600 million reparative commitment to Burkina Faso. Not as aid, not as charity, but as justice. And standing there beside him was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young president who had dared to defy the West, who had chosen dignity over dependence. For a heartbeat, two histories touched the Caribbean and Africa, both scarred, both proud, both ready to begin again. So tonight we ask, what does it mean when a nation apologizes not out of guilt, but out of truth? Can moral courage reshape the future where politics has failed? This is not just a story about money. It's about memory, about a man who spoke the word sorry and meant it, and another who answered not with anger, but with grace. If you believe that real justice begins with honesty, if you believe that Africa's dignity deserves to be heard, then stay with us. Because this is the day the silence finally broke. The heat in Ouagadougou that afternoon was unforgiving, yet no one moved. Thousands of Burkinabés stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on the podium. It wasn't just a diplomatic visit, it was something the world hadn't seen in generations, a nation from the Caribbean crossing the ocean, not to demand, not to lecture, but to apologize. When the Prime Minister of Jamaica began to speak, the tone was neither rehearsed nor polished. It was human. He paused often as if the weight of centuries sat on his chest. And then quietly but unmistakably he said, "For too long many of us stood on the sidelines complicit in silence, benefiting from an imbalance that stripped Africa of her dignity. For that, we were wrong. Profoundly wrong." The audience went still. No applause, no murmurs. Just the sound of wind moving through flags, the flag of Jamaica beside that of Burkina Faso fluttering like two old friends reunited after lifetimes apart. He continued, his voice trembling but clear. "This apology is not symbolic. It is backed by action. Jamaica will make a $600 million reparative commitment to the people of Burkina Faso." For a second time froze. People looked at each other in disbelief. Some gasped. Others covered their mouths. Then the square erupted not in cheers of victory, but in a roar of emotion. Elderly women wept openly. Young men waved the Burkinabé flag in the air, shouting, "Justice, justice." The Prime Minister raised his hand for calm. This is not charity. This is not aid. This is a debt being acknowledged, a wrong being addressed. He spoke not from a script, but from conscience. He described how small nations like Jamaica had also been trapped in the same global order that punished independence and rewarded obedience. He confessed that his country too had been silent when it should have spoken, compliant when it should have resisted. "We spoke of solidarity," he said, "but rarely acted with courage." Every sentence seemed to echo through decades of silence. In front of him sat President Ibrahim Traoré, his eyes fixed on the speaker, his posture calm but his presence magnetic. For months, Traoré had been labeled a rebel by Western powers, a soldier who refused to play by their rules. But now in the heart of Africa, another leader was saying to him publicly, "You were right." The Jamaican leader's voice deepened. "Mr. President, your nation has become a symbol of courage in an age where silence masquerades as diplomacy. You have chosen the hard road, the road of sovereignty and self-reliance, and for that you have earned the respect of the world." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some called his words revolutionary diplomacy. Others whispered, "This is how history begins again." He did not speak in numbers or economic jargon. He spoke of moral repair, of bridges rebuilt, of dignity restored. "Africa was never poor," he said slowly. "Africa was made poor through structures designed to extract wealth and punish resistance." That single line was enough to change the atmosphere. The audience rose to their feet. Even the military officers standing guard saluted, because at that moment a prime minister from across the ocean was telling the truth the world had long avoided. He then explained the structure of Jamaica's reparative fund. It would come without conditions, without supervision to be used. However, Burkina Faso deemed necessary education, healthcare, agriculture, or technology. For the first time, he said, "We are not trying to shape your development narrative. We are simply saying, this is yours." It was more than an apology. It was a transfer of trust. And then he looked beyond the podium, beyond the cameras, as if speaking not just to Africa, but to history itself. There comes a time when moral responsibility must outweigh political convenience. That time for Jamaica is now. The applause that followed was long, unending, and heavy with tears. For those who were there, it didn't feel like a speech. It felt like the closing of an old wound and the quiet beginning of a new world. The moment the Jamaican Prime Minister uttered those words, Africa was never poor. Africa was made poor. The atmosphere in the square shifted. It wasn't just applause anymore. It was something deeper, something that came from the gut. You could feel the roar rise from the crowd like thunder from the earth itself. A young woman standing near the stage clasped her hands and whispered, "He said it. Finally, someone said it." Old men who had lived through colonial wars stood motionless, tears streaking their weathered faces. And in the middle of it all, President Ibrahim Traoré remained still, his expression unreadable. His fists gently closed, his eyes fixed on the man speaking truth to power. Then came the next blow, calm, deliberate, devastating. Too many nations have worn the mask of diplomacy while bleeding silently. Too many have bent their knees in the name of loans and cooperation. But what you, Mr. President, have done is remind the world that dignity is not negotiable. A ripple of emotion swept through the air, pride, grief, vindication. Every word struck the wound of history and poured something healing into it. At that very moment, the world outside Burkina Faso began to react. Within minutes, major international outlets BBC, Al Jazeera, and CNN broke the story. Jamaica apologizes to Burkina Faso, commits $600 million in reparations. Social media exploded. In the Caribbean, students marched through Kingston holding signs that read, "Justice for the Motherland." In Accra, youth organizations projected Traoré's image on public buildings with the caption, "Dignity is not for sale." But not everyone was cheering. In Washington, one senior official called the move symbolic populism, warning that financial commitments like this could destabilize international aid frameworks. In Paris, a government spokesperson smirked, calling it a gesture that plays well on social media but has no geopolitical weight. And yet their voices sounded small compared to what was happening in the streets of Ouagadougou. Because inside that square, the people weren't listening to pundits. They were listening to their own history being acknowledged for the first time. The Prime Minister continued undeterred by the weight of what he had unleashed. This apology will not end with applause. It will continue in trade, in education, in shared development. We will not be silent when Africa stands alone. Every pause in his speech was filled with chants of Traoré, Traoré, Jamaica, Africa united. At one point, a camera captured something extraordinary, a Jamaican flag being passed hand to hand across the Burkina Faso crowd until it reached the stage. The Prime Minister lifted it high, then handed it to President Traoré. The crowd erupted again, a sea of fists in the air, voices shouting in unison, "One people, one destiny." That was the emotional climax, the moment when history and hope collided. You could almost feel the ghosts of the past, the enslaved, the colonized, the silenced standing in that crowd, finally hearing someone speak for them. Then Traoré himself stood. The noise quieted immediately. He took the flag, pressed it to his heart, and simply said, "This is not aid. This is respect." No grand speech, no theatrics, just a sentence, simple, powerful, unshakable. And that silence that followed, it wasn't emptiness. It was the sound of dignity reclaiming its space. Later that evening, across African media, commentators described it as the day Africa and the Caribbean became one voice. Young journalists called it the new Bandung moment, a rebirth of the South-South solidarity that the world thought had died with the Cold War. Even in the United States, African-American leaders and activists reacted. The Reverend Al Sharpton called it a turning point in moral diplomacy. A former senator wrote on X, "If Jamaica can do this, what's stopping the rest of us from confronting the truth?" It became impossible to ignore, not because of the money, but because of what it represented: a reversal of centuries of silence, a message that justice does not flow from the north to the south anymore, it can also rise from the south itself. That day, Ouagadougou wasn't just a city, it was a symbol. And what began as an apology had become something far greater, a declaration that history long buried was finally beginning to heal itself. In the days that followed that historic afternoon in Ouagadougou, the world began to feel the ripples. The $600 million apology was not just a figure printed in headlines, it was a shockwave that reached homes, parliaments, and hearts across 2 continents. In Burkina Faso, people poured into the streets not to protest, but to clean, to plant trees, to rebuild schools. Local radio stations played the speech on loop. In remote villages, elders replayed Traore's words from loudspeakers mounted on motorbikes. This is not aid. This is respect. For them, those words were more than pride. They were permission. Permission to dream again, to believe that the world had not completely forgotten. At night, students at the University of Ouagadougou painted a mural on the campus wall. On one side, a portrait of Ibrahim Traoré. On the other, the Jamaican Prime Minister. Between them, a single sentence: "Reparation is not money, it is dignity returned." Inside the government, Traoré's cabinet moved fast. The Burkina Faso-Jamaica Reparative Council was formed, a 20-member body made up of youth representatives, economists, farmers, and traditional chiefs. Their mission to manage the fund transparently and make it serve the people, not politics. The Prime Minister's promise had been clear: no oversight, no interference, and Traoré intended to honor that by creating a model of collective decision-making, where every major project had to be publicly debated before funding was released. The first allocations were announced within 2 weeks: $120 million for rebuilding rural schools destroyed during years of instability, $80 million for women-led agricultural cooperatives to restore arid farmland, $150 million for solar energy and irrigation systems in the northern provinces, $50 million to modernize hospitals and train local doctors abroad. For once, the announcements did not come from foreign consultants or IMF press releases. They came from community leaders reading them aloud under mango trees. The social mood shifted. Markets in Ouagadougou buzzed with optimism. Farmers spoke of planting for export again. Young engineers began designing apps for transparent fund tracking. And in a symbolic gesture, Traoré declared the first Saturday of each month as National Restoration Day, a day when government officials, students, and soldiers would work side by side, cleaning streets, planting, or teaching in rural schools. It wasn't policy, it was philosophy. A new form of politics born from responsibility, not rhetoric. But beyond the joy, there were tremors in the diplomatic world. In Europe, economists dismissed the move as unsustainable populism. The European Commission issued a cautious statement, warning that such unilateral financial transfers might disrupt international frameworks for aid coordination. In Washington, the tone was quieter but more strategic. A State Department memo leaked to the press revealed concerns that the African-Caribbean Reparative Alliance could undermine Western influence in the Global South. At home in Jamaica, Parliament was divided. Opposition leaders questioned the wisdom of giving away such a large sum when our own people are struggling. But the streets told a different story. Outside Kingston's Emancipation Park, thousands gathered with drums, waving banners, reading Burkina Faso, today, the world tomorrow. Justice has no borders. Churches across the island rang their bells at noon in solidarity with Africa. A historian from the University of the West Indies called it the first true act of moral foreign policy since independence. What had begun as a simple apology was now reshaping political identity in both nations. Burkina Faso was being talked about not as a battlefield, but as a blueprint. Jamaica, once just another Caribbean island, was suddenly a moral superpower, a nation defining leadership not by wealth but by conscience. And in that quiet aftershock, one truth began to emerge. This was not the end of an old world, it was the birth of a new kind of diplomacy. One that did not rely on might or money but on mutual dignity, the currency of a just future. While Burkina Faso and Jamaica celebrated a moral victory, the ripples of that apology reached far beyond the Atlantic. In Washington, it wasn't just diplomats who were paying attention, it was professors, pastors, veterans of the civil rights era. The story began appearing not on the back pages but on primetime talk shows. On MSNBC, a commentator asked, if Jamaica can acknowledge its role in history and act on it, what's stopping us, the United States, from doing the same? The question hung in the air. Because in a country still wrestling with its own racial memory, the sight of a small Caribbean nation offering justice not in words, but in dollars touched something raw. Across Black American communities, the moment was seen as vindication. Church leaders in Atlanta called it the modern-day Emancipation Proclamation, written in Africa's name. At Howard University, students held a panel titled Reparations Without Permission Lessons from Jamaica and Burkina Faso. For many, it was proof that moral courage didn't require global power, only integrity. But not everyone welcomed it. In Congress, a few voices labeled Jamaica's gesture reckless idealism, suggesting that it sends the wrong signal to developing nations. In financial circles, analysts at Goldman Sachs and the IMF worried aloud that a new precedent of South-to-South reparations might disrupt the Western aid system, which has long positioned itself as the sole benefactor of the global South. Meanwhile, in Europe, the tone was quieter but revealing. Editorials in Le Monde and The Guardian admitted what few dared say before, that Africa's call for restitution had moved from protest to policy. A British columnist wrote, "It is a dangerous day for those who built their empires on silence." At the United Nations, the effect was immediate. Delegates from Ghana, Tanzania, and Barbados called for a new framework to study intra-South reparations, a concept unthinkable just months earlier. Even diplomats from Latin America privately congratulated the Jamaican mission, calling it a moral earthquake. But perhaps the most profound reactions came from ordinary Americans. In Detroit, retired auto workers donated to a grassroots campaign called 600 Million Hands, aiming to raise funds for African education in solidarity. In California, descendants of enslaved Jamaicans and African Americans jointly petitioned Congress for a commission on global restorative justice. The gesture had crossed oceans, but more importantly, it had crossed psychological borders. For decades, Americans had been told that Africa needed saving. Now, for the first time, they were seeing a different image, Africa being honored, respected, restored not as a victim, but as an equal partner in global morality. And through it all, one figure kept appearing on TV screens: President Ibrahim Traoré. The young soldier who had once been dismissed as a radical was now being quoted in editorials and policy journals. "Dignity is not negotiable," he had said. In America, that line resonated with a generation that remembered Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, "A man who won't die for something is not fit to live." The West had long believed that moral leadership required wealth. But that day in Ouagadougou, the poorest nations on earth reminded the richest what moral wealth truly looked like. It wasn't power, it wasn't politics. It was truth, finally spoken aloud. As the final echoes of applause faded in Ouagadougou, something deeper lingered in the air, a quiet that felt like prayer. Two flags fluttered against the evening sky, the gold and green of Jamaica, the red and green of Burkina Faso. Beneath them, faces glowed not from lights, but from a feeling that had no name, the feeling of history turning. That night, the city did not sleep. Radios replayed the speech again and again. Farmers sat outside their homes listening. Mothers hummed old liberation songs. Somewhere in the crowd, a child whispered to her father, "Will this change everything?" And he answered softly, "It already has." But history is never simple. Because every apology, no matter how sincere, carries a warning, a reminder that justice must be protected once it awakens. In the weeks that followed, new alliances began forming quietly across the global South. Leaders from Ghana, Tanzania, and Barbados reached out to explore similar reparative partnerships. Even in faraway places like Brazil and Indonesia, politicians spoke about moral independence, a phrase inspired by the events in Ouagadougou. Meanwhile, the old powers watched. Analysts in Paris and Washington warned that the age of moral rebellion had begun. Some feared a collapse of influence, others feared something greater, a reawakening of conscience. Yet amid the uncertainty, one truth became undeniable. Burkina Faso, a land once dismissed as small and poor, had become the moral compass of a restless world. And Jamaica, by daring to speak first, had rewritten the unwritten rule that the weak must always wait for permission to do what is right. This wasn't a revolution of armies or weapons, it was a revolution of integrity. A revolution led not by superpowers, but by ordinary people and humble nations who decided that silence was no longer acceptable. So tonight, as we reflect on that moment on the handshake between Prime Minister and President on the two flags waving in the dusk, we must ask ourselves, can the world truly heal if we keep denying where the wounds began? And if justice can begin in a place like Ouagadougou, what stops it from spreading everywhere else? For those who believe in Ibrahim Traoré's message that dignity is not negotiable, this is your moment to listen, to share, to keep the truth alive. Because someday, when our grandchildren read about this chapter, they won't remember the dollar amount. They'll remember that two small nations stood tall and said together, "Let the era of silence end. Let the era of justice begin." If you believe that what happened in Ouagadougou was more than politics, if you believe it was the rebirth of conscience, then share this story. Share it for every nation that still waits for justice. And subscribe if you believe, like us, that the truth deserves a louder voice than power.